very much. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be allowed to be part of the Humanities Week. It is always a great honor to speak on behalf of the Humanities. So I really thank our Dean for giving us this wonderful welcoming speech. I thank Barbara very much for the introduction. It is a great honor as a medievalist to speak to all of you. And in a way, I think I have a certain historical justification. It has nothing to do with me, but basically the entire field of humanities as we know it today were actually founded by German medievalists. So basically the entire exploration of literature in the vernacular, that was really sort of the discovery of the German Romantics, and then they were followed by French and Italian and English. But really sort of the medievalists were at the beginning. If you think of the brothers Grimm, whom you all know from your fairy tales, they were really philologists. They really studied the Middle Ages. So in a way, I'm very, very honored and very happy that I was asked to participate. I wanted to say hello and thank you to my colleagues and my students. I have lots of students actually in this room because I also teach one of those humanities seminars, and there are lots of friends I recognize. So thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to, in a way, challenge all of us by looking into one of the key questions that often comes up to us. Why do we even teach this or that subject matter? What makes it so relevant? And I try to be as provocative as possible and try to explain why many of my courses I deal with topics such as eroticism and love. A couple of years ago, I tortured all our technicians because I had a listserv, and as the keyword for the listserv, I had eroticism. So everyone had to spell eroticism every time. So I made this word really well known. But what is really the humanities, and I think what our dean already addressed to some extent, it very much drives me as well, like all my colleagues, because it's the love of teaching or the teaching of love. And so the big question might be right away, why teach love? Or rather, why not teach love? I always like to begin my classes by raising a very simple question, which I would like to readdress here. We all know when we want to drive a car, we have to pass a driver's test. We're only allowed to drive a car if we have passed the basic skills. The car is not a very complicated matter. But when it comes to love and marriage, what driver's license do we have? I would venture to say it would behoove us very much to learn a little bit more about love in order to handle probably the most difficult thing in all of human life. So why not teach this? And frankly, what is more important in life than love? What would be life without love, whether in the Middle Ages or in the present? But these are just very general aspects, and I would like to emphasize, moreover, what is more difficult than love. This is a very complicated topic, and you can approach it from the philosophy, religion, ethics, moral studies, biology, religion, literature. So it is one of the most complex issues, and I would dare say that virtually or almost every text we have or any work we have in the humanities has something to do with love, including jokes, because you wouldn't tell those jokes in France if you hadn't some kind of connection with the other people. So altogether, the question is, what does the teaching of love achieve really at the university? You know, there's always the question, why would the university even consider teaching eroticism and love as an important subject matter? And I think my broad responses already would confirm that is the stuff the humanities are all made of. And just looking around the room, I see my colleague from Russian. I mean, how many Russian novels are deeply determined by the torturous question, what is love? The same thing applies to Dante. You will hear more about that tomorrow. So virtually wherever you look, modern, past, present, it is always somehow connected with this topic. And so my ultimate goal as a teacher is to use a historical lens. You know, I always tell them, basically, it is very, very difficult for us today really to enter into the discussion of love because it's so personal, so emotional. And in order to do a thorough study of any subject matter, it is better to have some kind of a distance. I'm thinking about the Heisenberg principle. You know, the closer you get to the subject matter, the more you influence and you change it. So what I like then to say, if I use a historical or literary cultural lens, then I build some distance and I can talk exactly about the same thing that concerns all of us on a daily basis, but I've built a scholarly, more objective distance. And that's what the humanities can really do. So in a way, it's a laboratory. The humanities are a laboratory of human emotions. And in order to explore those emotions in a more objective way, literature is a great vehicle to achieve that goal. And so finally, my last or first point, what else should we teach? There's nothing more relevant, right? But anyway. The humanities have a lot to do, of course, not only, but a lot to do with words. We are sort of the wordsmiths. We like to work with words. We consider in the humanities words as one of the most instrumental tools to build community, to reach out, to communicate. And so I just show you one of my book titles. It was a conference I had, I think, 2005, Words of Love and Love of Words. If you play with that a little bit, you find out very, very quickly that throughout times, those who have developed a love for words were sort of gaining a springboard to experience what love really was. So, playfully speaking, those who begin to love words are readying themselves to experience love. Those who cannot appreciate words or poetry, if you will, are not really entitled to experience the secrecy of love. Anyway, my historical perspective pertains to the Middle Ages, and I wanted just to show you a couple of images. Also, we'll play a little bit of music if it all works technically. But this is a wonderful illustration that might highlight right away what I'm doing in my class. Keep in mind, my students, they're all, fairly young, I suppose. And of course, I suppose that they come to my class in the assumption I will teach sex. And the word across campus is always, oh, class, and he teaches sex in the Middle Ages. And I do have books about sexuality in the Middle Ages, so you can enjoy those, but these are scholarly books. And in essence, however, I always insist I never teach sex. I teach love and the words that are sort of the cultural expression of the deeper aspects. This image I'm showing you here was included or is included in the very famous Manesse manuscript, today housed in Heidelberg. And it just simply shows in a very stereotypical fashion two lovers, she holding him or his head leaning against her chest. And he holds then, if you can recognize this, a bird, the falcon. And I just talked about that yesterday in class, in the humanities class. And it really helps me to pinpoint in a dramatic fashion what at least medieval poets have talked about when they addressed love. The falcon, if you can follow me, is of course a bird of prey. It's a wild animal or bird which has the instinct of killing and then taking its prey and flying away and eating up its prey. In the Middle Ages, they developed the art of hunting with birds, which required an intensive training process. These birds have to be tamed, they have to be disciplined. And so the falcon became a symbol, of all of courtly culture, and it still is in some corners of the world. Actually, if you want to do the art of hunting, you have to read the manual written by Emperor Frederick II about 1230. That's the one definitive textbook on hunting with falcons. But much more important is that the image of the falcon was quickly then utilized as a symbol of what love really means in the literary discourse, namely the taming of the wild forces. So basically, love was regarded as a very dangerous passion that if you do not control this and discipline it and cultivate it, you can run into a lot of problems and dangers. So the falcon who overcomes through training, culture, and education by means of words, for example, becomes the symbol of the disciplined, the reined-in emotions that then can be channeled into a cultural activity. So the wild bird becomes the messenger of words. And these words are words of love, and this love can then become an expression of culture. So that is just the medieval expression, but it applies, of course, to any modern love poet. Anyone who deals with words is all the same. But I think the symbolism that you get here is very, very powerful and very striking. So the question then is, why would we then talk about the Middle Ages and love? Aren't we thinking normally about heroes, warriors, Nibelungenlied? We just finished reading a little bit in the original with my students. Would you not want to hear about knights and tournaments? And as I've just listed here, and I want us to enter this a little bit further, when you look more carefully at the world of the courts, and let's say the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, you discover that that world was primarily concerned with the theme of love. Every educated person talked about love. There was no other topic but to talk about love, because it was the, let's say, the platform for individuals to reflect upon the gender relationship, to reflect upon character development, to ruminate on ethics, on morality, on philosophy, and including religion. So hence, as I listed here, the discourse on love was very prevalent at the courts, in the church. At least anyone who was learning Latin was not necessarily yet a priest, but anyone who was a student in and for and with the church had to learn about love. Let's say reading Ovid. There was a major Roman poet who was then received in the High Middle Ages, but then also very much at the universities, where people had to train intellectually to discuss and to debate. And tell me, I dare you, give me a topic you could fight over more than love. That is one of the most contentious issues. And so to debate love and to evaluate gender relationship is one of the best ways to develop, if we want to use a modern word, to develop dialectics and rhetorical skills. Hence, everywhere. And so I have just here the general phrase: to study the Middle Ages means to study love, plain and simple, but also extremely complex. And not that I want to give you a lot of details, that is for my class, just here for the public presentation. These are just names of the major poets. And all over Europe, whenever you look at culture, whatever has come down to us in a very refined, luxurious, elegant form, that was love poetry recorded in medieval manuscripts, for which thousands of animals had to leave their life, so there's always a victim in the background. But it is a pan-European theme, which brings me to something that what we do in our department, and which I really like a lot. We call our department Transcultural Studies. And, Steve, you know exactly, and Barbara and everyone else, you know what we mean by that. But really, the Middle Ages, as far as I can say, were the forerunners of a very interesting phenomenon. The Europeans are coming back only now. Namely, there was no really national boundaries. There was a European courtly culture. And the theme of love connected everyone, whether you lived in southern Portugal, or whether you traversed the Baltic countries, whether you lived in northern Scotland, or you lived somewhere in the Adriatic Sea or in Marseille, very much the Provence, where all this troubadour poetry emerged, there was one common cultural development. And I find that extremely interesting because it is transnational, transcultural, and finds its common ground, the common denominator, in the great theme of love. So troubadours, they wrote in Provençal, Occitan in other words, then the troubadours, they were women poets. We also have the trouvères, these are northern French poets. We have the Minnesang, that's German, Dolce Stil Novo is Italian. You have the Carmina Burana, that's Latin, and sometimes macaronic, German, Middle High German and Latin. And we have late medieval English love poetry and so forth. Just an image of how the medieval illustrators then depicted many different themes of love. Love was the one theme that was shared by both genders, and very much in the upper class, of course. What the peasant class normally did, we don't quite know. We have some indications. We have some poets like Neidhardt, whom we'll discuss next week, and who then slowly begin by the 13th century to reflect also on the lower classes. But what we know is of an aristocratic class, so very exclusive. Certainly, admittedly, we do not know what the masses of people really thought or felt. What we have is aristocratic culture. And at the same time, you might think, well, okay, this guy is dabbling all the time in, well, thinly veiled sexual illusions, so he's full of lust, and he teaches and seduces his poor students, going to all terrible directions, and why should we let him teach this? For that reason, I thought I better be careful and also give you a different angle to the entire discourse of love. With discourse, I mean that's what we do in the humanities. We look at lots of different opinions and see how people at certain time contributed to that whole discussion and how then they formed a certain opinion. And as we probably all will agree, of course, the topic of love is such a multifaceted phenomenon, so complex, so difficult. And for that reason, I want to introduce quickly for a few minutes a dimension of love that I have not addressed yet. Most of you might not even think about it right away. So I want to bring in the whole concept of a religion. When people sort of sometimes say, oh, your course material is maybe too erotic, too graphic, then I like to say, well, why don't you simply take the Old Testament? Take the Song of Songs and you get it all. It is so graphic. And so I'm in good shape. And then, of course, New Testament is equally very dedicated to love, but however, in a very, let's say, spiritual, religious way. So what I would like to do then is to introduce one major writer who representing many, many other poets and writers throughout the Middle Ages, and this was Hildegard of Bingen, who only wrote in Latin. She was an abbess, but she was also a mystic. And we face here a very, very strange but extremely powerful phenomenon in which primarily women, medieval and early modern women, could partake because they were privileged to be part of a discourse on love, as erotic as you can imagine, but with the Godhead. So these were women, Hildegard of Bingen. I will give you lots of other names in a minute, and I can tell you as much as you want, but I only touch the issues a little bit. These were women, some men as well, who were graced with the extraordinary experience of having a vision or a revelation, an experience of the Godhead alive, in a awake condition, not induced by drugs, but maybe through lots of fasting, sleep deprivation, and meditation, suddenly then the experience of the Godhead. I have personally no idea what that meant for those people. I do not try to understand their religious experience. That's something very, very personal. That's what they could do and what they shared. But what they then did in order to express this ineffable, or another beautiful word, this apophatic experience, an experience for which there are no words. I mean, have you ever seen a poet who is suddenly at a loss for words? But The mystics were suddenly at a loss of words because they wanted to talk about an experience of an absolutely extraordinary kind, and then they resorted to the most self-evident medium, and they just simply fell back to the discourse of love and coined all those very, very profoundly religious experiences in terms of love. What I'm giving you here is one of the famous illustrations by Hildegard of Bingen, who in her discourse on love explores the correlation between, and it's really absolutely stunning, and I wish we had some astronomers here, namely the correlation between macrocosm and microcosm. So the religious experience of these mystics, expressed very often in very concrete terms of love, was also an attempt to come to terms with this extraordinary, uncanny relationship between us, who are microcosm, and then the outer world beyond maybe the cosmos, where maybe God rests. So that's exactly where our astronomers begin to fail. They only know the extent of cosmos and can say whatever 13 billion light years, but we as historians of medieval mystical literature can say, don't worry, we know what's beyond, because the macrocosm has already been described by Hildegard of Bingen. And so you have suddenly, maybe in a nutshell, a very beautiful definition, I think, of what the humanities at large try to do. We all have in us, as Hildegard says, both the micro as well as the macrocosm. We can talk in a mundane, pedestrian way about the microcosm. That is our existence. We might feel, we might not feel the macrocosm. And the poetic word, the word of love, the mystical image of the encounter between human and the divine, suddenly builds a bridge to something they call macrocosm. That is not a rational explanation, that is a mystical explanation. Don't ask me how to explain that further. I can only describe what they presented, and yet at the same time I find this absolutely stunning what these poets then did. Just a very brief selection of many of these mystics, from Hildegard of Bingen, who died 1179, to Catherine of Siena, Brigitta of Sweden, or Julian of Norwich. So these are poets from all over Europe. And once again, it is a pan-European experience. And I wanted you to have, at least for a few minutes, the opportunity to understand what we're really talking about. And I have here, I hope this works. So just an example, you can find easily many YouTube videos online, and you can easily enjoy this, or if you don't enjoy it, that's up to you. And it's of course extremely, very, very deeply Catholic. Do not get me wrong, I do not want to advocate any religion. I only want to point out how much the discourse of love could easily extend to many different areas, and in this case, it's the religious dimension. And by the way, you do have similar experiences of kind of mysticism, both in Jewish religion as well as in Islamic religion. If you think about the dervishes, for example, the whole culture that I cannot touch here. But again, it is a human experience. So the music that we just listened to expressed to some extent the attempt. She composed that music, by the way. Okay? She was a composer, as well as a poet, as well as a politician, as well as an administrator, as well as a gynecologist. She wrote a handbook about female sexuality. So she really knew her stuff. She was a Renaissance woman before the Renaissance. But I wanted just to illustrate to you how much this discourse had so many different facets. And wherever you looked, you suddenly could discover that this concern about love transformed an entire world. So this is the world of religion. And I just wanted to show you one of the textbooks that I'm using. This is sort of an example. It's a castle in northern Italy, Sabionara, north of Verona. And of course, you know Romeo and Juliet, so there's a kind of a connection. But this discussion of the discourse on love continued, of course, quite a bit. But I also want to demonstrate to you yet another dimension. You know, it sounds so far as well, this is religion, okay, and these are then maybe the poets, this is all fine, but it's a certain corner. I would like also to present to you how much the discourse of love was deeply influential and fundamental actually for all of learning, academic learning, and the discourse of love was indeed taught at the universities, at the schools. And a very simple explanation, for example, is that everyone who wanted to be learned had to learn Latin. And as all basic language teachers know, let's say in German, we wouldn't start in German 101, we wouldn't start with Kant and Freud. We start with French or German jokes rather, right? Simple stories and stories that the learners find interesting. And so anyone who had to learn Latin, of course, wanted to have a little bit more motivation. And what better to study and to learn Latin was than to study erotic poetry. So this was a very important teaching material. And we call then actually the entire world that I've addressed based on the discourse of love as the Renaissance of the 12th century. An absolute revolutionization or revolution of the entire culture based on the new experience. Love is the central topic. Everyone has to be involved. It is both educational, didactic, moral, ethical. And it helps also to revive the fittest, as the whole series is, right? And in this context, it is a one-time or one in a long series of revivals. The humanities are always concerned with reviving, bringing back old ideas and merging them with the postmodern world. So the revival of classicism or the classic Roman world happened already once in the 8th century, because of the 8th century Renaissance under Charlemagne. It happened in the 12th century, happened in 14th and 15th century Italy, and then the rest of the world. So I have here the names of probably the most famous lovers. Some of you might have heard of them. Abelard and Heloise are world famous. He died 1142. She died about 2 decades later. And they are extremely famous all over the world today. There's a whole scholarly community extending from Australia to southern France, to England, to Germany, all over the United States. The debate about these two lovers, their correspondence, and their destiny continues and rages. We are discussing in scholarship intensively what those letters might have meant. Because at one point he forced her, or actually he was forced by her uncle, she was an orphan by that time, to marry her, but they wanted to keep it a secret because he was a professor at the university. Okay, thank God nowadays professors can marry. That's very, very good. All right. But he didn't like it. He was too closely attached with the church, so he tried to keep the marriage a secret. And her uncle became so angry, Fulbert, that he sent a gang of 4 guys into his apartment who then castrated him as a form of punishment. Then disaster struck for him, of course. The entire city of Paris was in an uproar about this development. Then he just disappears. He puts her into a monastery, which he didn't quite like so much. Then he wrote a very famous autobiographical text writing about his own suffering, Historia Calamitatum. And she gets wind of this account and then starts one of the most important correspondence between her and him, where she hits him so hard on his head. Why did you abandon me? Why did you not write to me? Weren't we the most passionate lovers? And why did you force me to marry? I didn't want to marry you. I wanted to love you. Marriage for her, just for her, please, was one of the worst things. She wanted to love. She wanted to have the freedom of love. She didn't want to be bound by external issues. We still debate today in scholarship To what extent those letters are authentic or not, that is not a matter I have to decide tonight. That's a whole other lecture. I don't want to go into this, but I want to illustrate how much the discourse. That's always what I want to come back. The larger issue at stake in public is the discourse. So I refer you to this major writer, Andreas Capellanus, also a Parisian who wrote about 1180 to 1190, who imitated then Ovid and wrote a manual, please, about love. So it's a very interesting text, and we do not know until today what to make out of this text. In the first two books, consists of three, you have always men and women. Man always debating, trying to convince the woman, marry me or love me or share your love with me. And the women are always very smart, rhetorically superior, very eloquent, and push him always away and say, go to Paris, learn a little bit more before I will be nice to you. So, but the whole text, the first two books, are very complicated because we constantly are given laws. The God of love comes and gives laws. 1, 2, 3, 4, paragraph 6, D, section 4. How to love, what to love, whom to love, when to love, how to define, all that. At the very end, we have then King Arthur appearing and issuing laws once again. All those laws are then spread, according to the account, all over the world. Beginning of the Humanities, of course, right? So then book 3 begins, and Andreas Capellanus says the most shocking thing, and he says, this is all wrong. Women are awful, and marriage is the worst thing, and don't believe anything I've said, and it's all wrong. So what are we going to make out of this? Well, the very simple answer is, as far as I have done my research, love is a matter of discourse. And by avoiding the straightforward answer, by creating opaqueness, that's precisely what literature is about. Literature is not law. Literature is not recipe. Literature does not try to give us things in a straightforward way. Steve, you know very well with the parables, right? Nathan's ring, it's very difficult to interpret to some extent. But that's what literature does. That's what we're all about. We know exactly the issues, but we know we have to make them obscure so that we as readers begin to debate them, that we are challenged and evoke then many different answers to slowly approach the fuller understanding of the whole topic. So I would say Andreas Capellanus is a classical example for what literature does. It forces us to learn communication. And let me ask you from a very personal perspective, what is more important in a good partnership than communication? And that's precisely what the humanities teach. We teach basically literature, and literature is the medium for good communication with all the complex issues and so forth. So this discourse on love launches our culture today. And that happens already in the 12th century. Then we have other examples. That's the Carmina Burana. I have a beautiful example. The Carmina Burana is a very, very famous collection of songs. Everyone who is in music knows, of course, the Carmina Burana. These are Latin songs, sometimes Middle High German and then Latin, so a mixture. And I decided just to give you very quickly an illustration because Karl Orff, a German composer, used those texts and then created most beautiful music, eurythmic music. I cut short, you know this. All of you know this music from advertisement. I always entertain my students when I suddenly show advertisement for whatever, Gatorade or Adidas or something. And even our Pride of America, Pride of Arizona, well, it is the Pride of America, plays Carmina Burana. So I'm always very proud of our Pride of Arizona. But it connects really beautifully humanities with music, with athletics, with our public reputation. So I need to wrap it up a little bit so that we might have a few more minutes to discuss what I want to summarize as another image here of the Manesse manuscript. And all these elements you see here, the components, the aspects on the left side, in a way, are essential components of the discourse of love, or rather, the other way around. The discourse of love forces young people at that time to be motivated to do physical training, to become good knights, and thereby good lovers, technical training, but poetic training, musical training, and rhetorical training. What would be a good lover who couldn't speak? I want to meet the woman who's happy that her husband is a brute, dumb, not eloquent person. You know, people like eloquence. That's the way how we communicate with each other. And that's, by the way, also one of the first disciplines all medieval students studied. Everyone in the Middle Ages studied first, not English, French, German. They studied the trivium. They studied logic. Wow, logic? Really? Rhetoric and grammar. What a beautiful concept. Instead of immediately going to all the specialization, learn first how to express your love. That's what matters. Anyway, so that's what courtly love is all about. You could also talk about love as a discourse on psychology, and deals, of course, with training for communication, deals with emotions, again, rhetoric, of course, character analysis. So when you explore texts that deal with the theme of love, you are immediately forced to consider what character analysis means and how that works for you. And when Valentine's Day comes around, how many of you are still writing your own cards with your own statement, a poetic statement? Well, we buy the cards, and Hallmark does that for us. Sad. But the medieval poets, the medieval knights, they all had to do that. And that was a sign of character development. So the study of love for medieval people was one of the essential learning mechanisms. And all of this is most powerfully encapsulated in the most important French romance. I cannot help. I have to point out AP because, you know, he's our director of Silk. So the Roman de la Rose, a very powerful psychological romance. So if you ever want to read psychology in literary form, then that's what you have. The lover is looking for his rose, and he encounters enemies, such as the person called envy, person called jealousy, person called bad rumor, and all those hindrances that make it difficult for us, and that is now cast in literary form in the Roman de la Rose, which was one of the most popular texts in the entire Middle Ages. I skip all over this. I think I have just too much. I would skip a little bit further to tell you also what happens then in the late Middle Ages. We have a very significant change in the thematic orientation when poets begin to explore more and more, instead of courtly love, so love outside of the bonds of marriage, they begin to look into question of marriage. And I've listed here some of the most impressive poets. And you can see here, well, Johannes von Tepel, who writes a most stunning text about a man who has just lost his wife and debates with death about the justice for death to have taken away his most beloved spouse. Christine de Pizan, French, does the same thing. She loses her husband about 1392 and writes about 100 ballads reflecting on the sorrowfulness that has affected her life because she has lost the most beloved person in her life. And then finally, a Nuremberg German poet, there were many others, who wrote a book for widows. So the discourse shifts and focuses much more on the theme of marriage. Here's an image of Christine de Pizan. I could refer to Geoffrey Chaucer. I leave all this aside. We have also then increasingly by the late Middle Ages scholarly discussions or textbooks about marriage. And here's an example of how this manuscript looks like. It's very beautifully and clearly written, so easy to read. It really is, yes. Just take 50 more years and you try to read Martin Luther's handwriting, and that's a completely different story. So that's basically what I do, actually teach, and also a course in the Humanities. This is an image of the second edition of the book, because I try, and that's what I've tried also to formulate here, I try to use medieval concepts that were of great significance. And in this one big course, for example, eroticism and love in the Middle Ages, I try to show the students how much they really ought to learn and study the concept of love, both, well, from a learned tradition, which then would empower them in their private lives, really to avoid many of the pitfalls that affect our society. You give me the percentage. How many percent of our people get through divorce? 56 at least, right? It doesn't matter. It's just catastrophically high. It's completely wrong. So something is wrong in our society, so I like to tell my students, if you want to learn something for your life, what other topic is more interesting, important? Learn how to love. That is one of the hardest things to do. So we need to teach what is, and in light of this, what is essential. And I dare you to tell me that love is not essential. What is meaningful? Again, I dare you to tell me that love is not meaningful. Insightful, because you learn yourself and another person. It is very provocative. That's exactly what the university is all about. We are not about, as I would say, about providing patent answers. We are, at least in the humanities, we are here to provoke, right? We're here to stimulate thoughts. We want people to learn, to study, and find themselves in that process of intellectual challenge. And then, of course, it's important. What wouldn't it be? And it leads very much to critical thinking and analysis. And I find this always extremely interesting. When I come to that point, I suddenly then realize that we in the humanities are actually laying the foundation for our colleagues in the science. Without that critical thinking, students in the science couldn't do their work. So this is something you could win. This is a copy of one of my books. It's in the book package. And so I would like to end with this. I say in bold, yes, love is and should be an academic subject. And I would like to end by saying thank you one more time to my dean, for my department head, for allowing me to teach these topics. I think I have allayed some of the fears that something sordid and obscure could be taught. I hope I have convinced you that this is really an important, maybe the most important academic subject matter. And I hope I have whetted your appetite so that you all become medievalists as well. So on that note, thank you very much.